Okay, welcome to the Co-Movement Gym podcast. This is Andrew. Today we've got what's probably going to be a short episode, but I think it's going to be a really good one. We're going to talk about the supplement creatine. Creatine's been around for a long time, 30, 40 years. I remember it when I was young and just starting to work out, and it had already been around for a long time before that as well. A lot of you guys have probably heard of creatine, but there's a lot of new research coming out about some of its benefits beyond just sports performance and progress in the gym. And so I thought that'd be a really cool thing to talk about today. We'll talk about all of it, the benefits for people working out as well as otherwise, and a little bit about where you can find creatine, what it actually does in the body, and all that other good stuff. So to just kick it off, what is creatine? It's a totally natural substance. Our bodies make it. We get it in food. Our bodies make about 1 gram of creatine per day, roughly. And then it's made in the kidneys, liver, pancreas, and even in the brain. So about 1 gram a day is what we make endogenously. And then we can also get it from food, like I said. So where's creatine found? It's found pretty much entirely in animal products. So we're talking red meat, poultry, chicken, turkey, seafood, fish, shrimp, that sort of thing. I believe even in eggs as well. And roughly the amount of creatine that we get from our diet is probably, if you're eating a serving of red meat or fish or chicken, it's going to be about 0.5 gram per the typical serving. So the average person gets probably about 2 grams of creatine per day. That's roughly 1 gram that we make in our bodies, and then another 1 gram that we get from the foods that we eat throughout the day. So about 2 grams per day is what we're all getting every single day. So if we make creatine, then why supplement with it? And that's kind of the cool thing is a lot of research shows that if we can take in up to about 5 grams a day, so that's, 3 or 4 grams more than we get naturally, there are a lot of benefits that come along with that. And that's why people have been taking creatine as a supplement for decades.
The Co-Movement Gym podcast is supported by Native Path Supplements and Lombardi Chiropractic. Mention this podcast or click on the links in the episode description for a nice discount on us.
Now, as far as what creatine is, it's a totally natural substance. Like I said, our bodies make it. We get it from food. It's a combination of 3 amino acids. That's not really too important to know, but the amino acids are called arginine, glycine, and methionine. And then in our bodies, creatine is stored in its phosphorylated form. It's stored as something called phosphocreatine. That's also not very important for this podcast, but I do want to mention it because that phospho is important. If you want to understand what creatine does, it's important to know that creatine in our bodies has a phosphate attached to it. I'll talk a little more about that later, but if you want to know what creatine actually does in our bodies, it's important to know that that phosphate is a big part of how it works. Now, before we get into all the benefits and stuff, I thought maybe a good place to start would be the question regarding safety. We get this question a lot, especially it comes to us a lot from parents because a lot of kids start working out, usually middle school, high school age, and a lot of them hear from their friends or read in articles online that creatine might help them in the gym or with their sports performance. And so naturally they want to go buy some creatine, and then the parents are worried, wondering, is creatine safe? Should my kid take this? Is it like a steroid or something? Like, what is this? How is it going to affect them? So here's the really good news. And it's pretty much all just good news with creatine. I'll say that right up front. Creatine is one of the most studied supplements that exists. Certainly in the world of sports performance and athletic performance, I think the most studied supplement would be protein shakes. And then second to that is creatine. There are literally hundreds of studies, possibly thousands at this point over the last several decades on creatine and its safety and efficacy and all that kind of stuff. And the overwhelming consensus is that creatine is very, very safe. There are pretty much no side effects at all. When it comes to side effects, really the only one that crops up every now and then is GI upset. So for people who have very sensitive stomachs, Sometimes creatine can cause a feeling of like bloating or a gurgly, upset stomach or something like that. But aside from that, it's pretty much side effect free. I will say, though, that it's not advisable to take creatine if you have a kidney disorder. So if you have some sort of renal dysfunction, some sort of kidney dysfunction, creatine is generally contraindicated for people with those conditions. But in otherwise healthy individuals, creatine is pretty much side effect free. So that's great news. Now, here's the fun stuff. If we want to talk about what creatine does in the body and how it benefits us, I think it's important to learn. Some of you might be interested in this, some of you might not, but I think it's important to learn a little bit about ATP. Okay. When we talk, ATP is the molecule that all of our cells use for energy. It's the molecule that our bodies use for energy. When we talk about in like nutrition and stuff, when we talk about what fuels our body, we often talk about, and I do this too, we often talk about fats and carbohydrates as our fuel sources. You know, protein is what our muscles are made out of. It's what helps repair our bodies and stuff like that. It's what our bodies make things out of. But what fuels us is carbohydrates and fat. Now, that's not technically true. Carbohydrates and fats aren't really what give us energy. What gives us energy is ATP. So when we eat carbohydrates and fats, our bodies break those down and metabolize them in order to produce this molecule ATP. And ATP is what fuels everything in our body, all of our muscle contractions, all of our nervous system impulses, everything that our cells do. ATP powers everything. ATP is the energy currency of life. So if you want a lot of energy, whether it's in your muscles, brain, heart, organs, wherever, if you want a lot of energy, what you really want is a lot of ATP. But there's a problem. And the problem is that we run through our ATP stores very quickly, especially when we're doing intense things like exercise. And our brain actually uses a ton of ATP as well. So when you're doing heavy cognitive load type activities like studying or taking an exam or something like that, your brain is using a lot of ATP as well. Now, thankfully, this isn't much of an issue because our bodies are constantly producing more ATP. Every single second of every single day of your life, your cells are producing a lot of ATP. And that's because we use it so quickly to energize whatever it is that we're doing. It needs to constantly be replenished. But even so, during intense exercise and just high energy demand activities, we can get to the point where we start running low on ATP because we're using it more quickly than our cells can produce more. And in intense exercise, this is one of the things that can cause us to start to fail and start to fatigue and have to slow down if we're running, or stop a set from fatigue if we're weightlifting, something like that. We're just starting to run low on ATP. So what does this have to do with creatine? Well, the magic of creatine is that it helps you replenish your ATP stores faster. Really, that's what it comes down to. That's what creatine does in the body. It helps you recycle, it helps you generate more ATP when those ATP stores are running low. So let's dive into that just a little bit, just because it's interesting to understand. Some people might want to know how this works exactly. ATP is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. That just means that it's an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphate groups attached to it. So it's got 3 phosphates. So how do we get energy from ATP? Basically, a chemical reaction takes place that breaks one of those phosphate ions off of the ATP molecule. And if you remember high school chemistry, when you break a bond, it releases energy. So when our bodies take that ATP and they snap a phosphate off of it, that releases energy. And that's the energy that powers life. That's the energy that powers everything that we do. But the issue is, once we've done that, we no longer have that ATP molecule. We snapped off the phosphate to release the energy. That's great. But now we have adenosine with 2 phosphates on it. That's ADP. adenosine diphosphate, which is kind of useless. There's nothing else that we can do with this ADP molecule. That is, unless we attach another phosphate to it, and then we would turn that ADP back into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and then that could be used for more energy. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. I mentioned earlier that creatine is stored in our bodies as creatine phosphate. Creatine has a phosphate attached to it. And this is the cool thing that creatine does. When creatine comes across and when it interacts with an ADP molecule, it will donate its phosphate to that ADP, turning that ADP back into ATP. So what creatine is really doing, we use ATP to fuel our bodies. And when we do that, it turns into ADP, which is useless. Creatine helps recycle that ADP back into ATP so that we can now use that again to produce more energy. And then creatine can come along and donate another phosphate and turn it back into ATP again. So you can see creatine helps replenish our ATP stores, and it allows us to have a longer lasting supply of ATP, which just means that we have more energy that lasts longer. And you can see how that would be super useful for sports performance or working out in the gym. So that's the whole point of using creatine as a supplement, especially for performance enhancement in sports or working out. In a nutshell, creatine helps recycle ADP into ATP, and by doing so, it keeps ATP levels higher for longer. So we have more energy for longer. Okay, so if you're still with me, what does this mean in the real world? Basically, if you're working out, it means more reps, more sets, basically more volume, maybe even more days a week that you can work out. If you do a typical exercise and, something like a bicep curl or a bench press or push-ups or whatever, if you typically fail after, like, say, 9 or 10 reps and can't do any more, when your athletes who are taking creatine might find that they can make it to 11 or 12 reps before they fail, or athletes taking creatine might find that instead of doing their typical 3 or 4 sets of an exercise, they might be able to get a fourth or a fifth set. Basically, you just, as I said, you have more energy that lasts you for longer, and that can power you through a few extra reps or a few extra sets. So the fact that we can work out longer basically just means that we're going to get more out of our workouts, right? I mean, if you can do a few extra reps, a few extra sets, or even work out an extra day in the gym, thanks to creatine, all of that extra work that you're doing in the gym is going to lead to better progress and quicker progress over time. And that's why it's been so popular in the workout communities and in the sports performance world. Creatine doesn't just improve performance while you're working out. A lot of emerging research shows that it also improves recovery after workouts. This is one of the main reasons that I take it. Athletes often find that they're less sore the next day after working out and ready to perform again sooner after a workout. And this has especially been the case, and this is really cool to me as a runner. A lot of research in the last few years has been in the endurance world, in the endurance sports world. So runners, triathletes, swimmers, cyclists, that kind of thing. Some recent studies done on Ironman athletes. So people who are doing these long Ironman events that last like 10 hours have shown significant reductions in post-workout inflammation markers. So things like inflammatory cytokines and that kind of thing after their events. And a lot of research in the endurance sports world is showing that people who are running or cycling high mileage can do that week after week more easily if they're taking creatine on a daily basis. And as a runner, that's actually the main reason that I use it. When I'm running high mileage and I'm running 5 or 6 days a week, creatine helps me to recover well and be able to run again the next day without feeling too sore, and also feeling like I have good energy and I'm ready and want to run again. And then finally, the other main benefit for people who are working out is that creatine increases muscle mass more quickly than without. So that is, if you're working out to increase muscle mass, you want to put on a little bit of size, you'll probably have a little bit more success taking creatine than if you weren't. You might put on an extra pound a month of muscle or whatever. Now, it's not entirely understood, and this is interesting. It's not entirely understood how creatine leads to increased muscle mass. Part of it certainly has to do with the fact that creatine allows you to work out longer before you fatigue. We already covered that. You can do more sets, you can do more reps, and because of that, you get a better workout. And so, it makes sense that you would get better progress week after week and maybe add a little bit more muscle a little bit more quickly. But that doesn't seem to tell the whole story. In fact, originally it was thought that that's how creatine did improve muscle building results. It was originally thought that creatine lets you work out longer for harder, and so you're going to get more results over time quicker. But now recent research shows that creatine may have some other effects that lead to increased muscle mass beyond just what you get from the performance benefits. So it goes like this. One of the effects of creatine, some people might call this a side effect, but it's not really problematic in any sort of way. It's actually beneficial. So it's kind of funny to call it a side effect. But one of the effects of creatine is that it pulls water into the muscle cell. Okay. This is because creatine is osmotic. That just means that it draws water wherever it goes. So when you take creatine on a daily basis and you start to increase the amount of creatine that is stored in your muscles over time, that creatine pulls water into your muscle cells with it, which causes the muscle cells to swell a little bit. It's kind of like filling a water balloon. As you fill the water balloon, the balloon gets bigger, right? Well, when you take creatine and the creatine enters the muscle cell, it pulls water in with it, and that causes the muscle cell to swell a little. And this swelling of the muscle cell seems to turn on a whole bunch of really beneficial things. Transcription factors, satellite cells, insulin-like growth factor 1, mTOR proteins, and even like calcium and glycogen kinetics all change thanks to this cell swelling. And they all change in a really beneficial way, which seem to promote muscle growth. All of those things that I just listed, all of those changes are beneficial to building more muscle. And they all seem to be increased by this swelling effect of creatine. So that's kind of cool. Creatine helps us build more muscle in two ways. It helps us work out longer and harder so we get more out of our workouts. But then it also causes this cell swelling effect that has cellular effects that lead to increased muscle growth as well. And as I said before, all of this is totally safe and not something to be concerned about. So that's it as far as the benefits for athletes. In a nutshell, creatine is beneficial for athletes because it allows us to work out longer and harder, getting more out of our workouts and performing better in our sport. It helps us build muscle more quickly and easily, and it helps us recover faster after exercise, which is fantastic. I love that effect. And that's all the stuff that most people know about creatine. If you've read articles or muscle magazines back in the day or anything like that, all of the stuff that I just mentioned is the stuff that people have been talking about for 3 or 4 decades. Everyone knows that creatine helps athletes get stronger, put on more muscle, perform better in the gym, perform better in their sports. But now some of the really cool stuff that's coming out about creatine in like the last 10 years has to do with non-athletes, people who are getting benefits from creatine that have nothing to do with sports performance or muscle gain. And that's what I really want to talk about today. That's what's coming up next.
That weakness you're noticing isn't just about age. It's about giving your body the right protein to maintain your strength and independence. While most protein supplements lead to bloating and digestive issues after 50, grass-fed beef protein is different. Unlike whey and plant-based protein that can cause uncomfortable digestive problems, grass-fed beef protein is a dairy-free source of complete protein, which means it gives you all the building blocks your body needs in a form that it can actually use. Getting more native path complete protein in your diet helps maintain muscle strength without the stomach issues that make other proteins unbearable. So if you're looking for a delicious way to add more high-quality protein to your diet, look no further than Native Path Complete Protein. At only 110 calories per serving, each scoop packs 20 grams of grass-fed beef protein and contains zero sugar, dairy, soy, and gluten. It's available in chocolate and vanilla and tastes unbelievable in anything you add it to: water, coffee, smoothies, you name it. And the best part, Native Path offers amazing bundle deals. You can get 3 or 6 bags at a fraction of the price of other brands. Plus, they offer a 360-day no-risk, money-back guarantee and an 800 number for any questions about usage, recipes, or ingredients. And you'll speak to a real person that's ready to help. Visit nativepathcompleteprotein.com/co-movement and start your transformation today. Again, that is nativepathcompleteprotein.com/co-movement.
Okay, so as I said, creatine's greatest benefits, in my opinion, might actually have nothing to do with muscle or sports performance. Recent research on creatine has shifted towards things like mental health and brain health, cognitive benefits, memory improvement, metabolic health, bone health, and even cancer prevention, actually. Now, I won't talk about the cancer prevention thing too much. I didn't look into that research deeply, but there is, it's starting to be understood that in many ways cancer is a metabolic disease, or at least somewhat so. And the fact that creatine helps improve our mitochondria's ability to produce ATP, it makes sense that creatine helps out on the cancer front if it helps improve mitochondrial efficiency, let's say. So there's a lot of research going on there. That's all I want to say about that one. But let's get into some of these others that are really fascinating. We'll start with bone health. Okay, a lot of people are concerned about bone health, especially the aging population who might be getting bone mineral density scans regularly and being told that they're, low, that they have low bone mineral density. They might be slightly they might have osteopenia or even osteoporosis. That becomes a concern in our later decades, and especially among postmenopausal women. That's the group that's most susceptible to osteoporosis. So speaking of postmenopausal women, studies done on that group recently, and again, this is the population most susceptible to osteoporosis, showed that creatine interacts with bone cells and increases osteoblast activity. Now, osteoblasts are the cells in our bones that produce more bone. So if you're trying to grow more bone, it's the osteoblasts that do that. Osteoblasts basically produce new bone tissue. We'll leave it at that for right now. We'll keep it simple. So creatine interacts with those osteoblast cells and makes them more active, which helps lead to greater bone density and greater bone strength. The study that I'm talking about showed that supplementing with creatine for 1 year significantly reduced bone loss in the hip region. That's what they were looking at, because of course hip fractures are one of the greatest concerns, especially in older populations. So the research concluded that creatine has a bone preserving effect. And I want to emphasize that, a bone preserving effect. They didn't necessarily say that taking creatine will build more bone or increase bone strength, but what it does is it prevents the loss of bone, or it significantly slows the loss of bone. So if you're someone who year after year you're going to the doctor and they're saying that your bone mineral density has been declining over time and they want you to do something about it, taking creatine on a daily basis helps slow that decline in bone loss and maybe even bring it to a halt. Okay. And that's just if you're taking creatine, because if you add in resistance training, we get a whole nother effect. And we'll talk about that here, because this was a really big 10-year-long study with a lot of participants, showed that taking 11 grams of creatine per day plus walking and doing 2 years of resistance training improved bone geometry and bone strength. So it didn't just prevent the loss of bone, it actually improved bone strength and bone geometry. So this is awesome. These researchers concluded that, in the last study I said, taking creatine on its own was shown to slow the loss of bone. This research showed that if you take creatine and you include resistance training and walking on a regular basis, you can actually improve your bone mineral density and bone strength. So that's phenomenal, right? Because a lot of people are really concerned about this and want to know what they can do to preserve their bone health and maybe even strengthen their bones. Creatine is really, really useful in that regard. But just remember, if you want the bone strengthening effect, it's really important to add resistance training and weight bearing activities to your weekly routine. Another area of research that's kind of related to the one we just talked about involves the aging population and fall risk, and the consequences of falling. So studies have shown improved gait speed, so walking speed, better balance, and less falls when taking creatine on a regular basis in elderly individuals. And this probably has to do with a couple of things, right? So we talked about the increase in bone strength, so that helps a lot as far as preventing fractures and stuff. But as far as improved gait speed, better balance, and less falls, that probably has to do with, one, the fact that creatine helps you preserve more muscle mass. And having more muscle means you can catch yourself and prevent falling easier. The better balance probably comes from some of the neurological effects of creatine, which we haven't even talked about yet. That's really cool. But basically, creatine does a lot to support your muscular system and have better musculature, and support your brain health and have better cognition and functionality in terms of your brain's ability to coordinate your body and do all that kind of stuff. So that means better balance, less falls, obviously very, very important for the aging population. And that's what these studies are starting to show now. Creatine is also being studied, speaking of the aging population, for its potential in preventing fractures from falls. And this makes sense, right? That's, again, having more muscle mass means there's more tissue there to protect the bones. And it means, more muscle, more strength, a better ability to catch yourself and brace for impact if you do stumble, as well as the fact that creatine has that bone strengthening effect, so that if you do go down, you're less likely to have a fracture. And then this brings us to the last of the main areas where creatine can benefit us. And this is the one that's most exciting. This is probably the hottest new area in creatine research, especially in the last 10 years. There's tons of research going on about creatine and brain health. So it's well known that the brain makes its own creatine. All of our brains do. I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk. But it was long thought that taking supplemental creatine wouldn't do much to improve the level of creatine in the brain. And that's because creatine has a hard time crossing the blood-brain barrier. If you ingest creatine as a supplement, it goes into your bloodstream, and then it goes into all your muscles and stuff and your organs and wherever it's needed. But it has to cross what's called the blood-brain barrier in order to get into your brain. And creatine has a hard time doing that. At least that's what it was thought. And so they always figured, okay, creatine is important for the brain, but supplementing with it doesn't really seem to have much of an effect. Well, that's all changed recently when researchers have kind of discovered that you can supplement with creatine and increase the level of creatine in the brain. It's just a matter of taking more creatine. Okay, so most of the research going on in this area is now focused on taking 10, 15, or even 20 grams. 20 grams is the amount that's usually studied and even being recommended now for brain health. 20 grams of creatine per day. This does seem to increase the amount of creatine stored in your brain. And the reason for that is probably because, this is the hypothesis, creatine goes to your muscles first. That's why athletes have always had really good luck taking just 5 grams of creatine per day. And that 5 grams goes into our digestive system, into our bloodstream, and then the muscles soak it right up. Because the muscles are so hungry for creatine and because they soak up so much of it, you actually have to, only a little bit trickles into the brain. There's really not very much. So when you start taking more creatine, like I said, the current research is looking at 20 grams per day. and there's been a lot of studies done now focused on that amount. That's enough creatine per day that your muscles can take in as much as they want, and there's plenty left over to go to the brain. And what researchers are finding is that this does significantly improve the amount of stored creatine in our brains. And that has some incredible effects. Now, this research, like I said, is still really new. It's been going on for like maybe the last 5 or 10 years. But to give you an overview, they're studying creatine for benefits that range from memory, cognition, alleviation of depression. That's a really big one. And you hear a lot of anecdotes about people taking 20 grams of creatine per day and having greatly increased mood and energy levels throughout the day. Healing from concussions, that's a really big area. It's shown a lot of benefit there. And even neurological disorders, things like Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis, among other ones. So there's a lot of really cool research going on in this area. I think the next 10 to 20 years should be very, very interesting on this front. And along these same lines, another big benefit of the creatine, and this is something that I hope helps me as well, because I don't get the best sleep all the time, but creatine seems to mitigate the effects of sleep deprivation really well. There's some cool studies that show that people who are sleep deprived, maybe only get 3, 4, 5 hours a night, night shift workers, that sort of thing, when they take creatine in the morning after a bad night's sleep, they seem to be less affected by the poor sleep the night before. They have better energy throughout the day, better mood. They don't feel as groggy. They feel a little more like they got better sleep than they did. So that's, how many of us are sleep deprived? Or even if you normally sleep well, there's going to be some days where you don't. A big dose of creatine in the morning might go a long way towards helping you have a good day despite bad sleep. And then finally, another area that I thought was really interesting, I actually just came across this when I was doing a little bit of research for this podcast. I hadn't heard about this before, but pregnant and breastfeeding mothers. Interestingly, creatine is also being studied in this population. And I say interestingly because typically when it comes to pregnancy, that's an area where doctors are always very, very cautious, and they say, don't take any supplements. They'll say maybe take folic acid. That's well known to help during pregnancy. Maybe, a prenatal multivitamin, something like that. But typically they warn pregnant women to avoid taking most supplements just for reasons of caution. It's very prudent to be cautious in that situation, right? Creatine seems to be nothing but beneficial for pregnancy. It's showing impressive benefits. Recent research has shown benefits for fetal development. And I'm not sure exactly what the specifics are there, but that's what I came across is benefits for fetal development. And then also decrease in complications during pregnancy, as well as potentially maintaining better energy levels and more stable energy levels for the pregnant mother. So again, this is very, very new research. I'm not sure where it's going to end up in another 5 or 10 years' time, but so far everything looks very promising as far as creatine during pregnancy and helping support a healthy fetus as well as a healthy mother. So that's pretty much it for the benefits of creatine. Who should take creatine? Maybe that's the thing to start with next. And if you followed along so far, you'll probably guess what I'm going to say is, in my opinion, almost everyone can benefit from taking creatine. Obviously, athletes and people who work out can use it for performance to get better results in the gym and to perform better at their sport. That's been well known for a long time. And everyone else, including athletes, but everyone else too, can use it for the numerous health benefits that I've already mentioned. In my opinion, I'd say that the people who might benefit the most from creatine would be the elderly population, especially if they combine it with a little bit of resistance training and daily walking, and also vegans or vegetarians, only because they don't get as much creatine from the diet as people who eat animal products. Remember I said our bodies make about 1 gram a day. We get another roughly 1 gram a day from meat and animal products. So if you eat animal products regularly, you're getting maybe 2 grams a day. Vegans would be getting just the 1 gram a day that their bodies make. So supplemental creatine would be useful for everyone, but even more useful if you don't eat many animal products. And then what about kids? Because this is the question that we get the most. Parents are always concerned about what their kids want to take, and kids usually around middle or high school age start thinking about creatine since it's the most widely used sports supplement that there is. Well, creatine is safe for pretty much everyone, like I said, and that includes kids. After all, even kids are making creatine in their own bodies every day and getting it from the foods that they eat. So if you feed your kids eggs and fish and red meat, chicken, they're getting plenty of creatine from that. And taking supplemental creatine is totally fine and not contraindicated for kids. That said, I'm always a little uncomfortable recommending supplements for children. That just, I don't know, it just seems a bit odd to me. And I don't really see too much reason why, a young child would need to take creatine. So my recommendation would probably be wait until about the age of 14. And if you have an athletic kid who wants to play sports, who wants to start working out at the age of 14, 15, 16, if they want to take creatine, it's not going to do them any harm. It'll probably only give them benefits. But, that's a question or a decision for parents to make for their kids themselves. An exception to that, though, would be, I think it might be useful for, and this is a big concern these days, it might be useful for children who are dealing with issues like ADHD or similar conditions involving memory and attention and focus and cognition. Given the incredible brain benefits that we get from creatine, I hope some more research is done in that area because, of course, there are a lot of kids these days with attention issues and focus issues and, ADHD, that sort of thing. And creatine seems to be something that might help in that area. More research needs to be done. I didn't come across much yet. So maybe in the future, if I hear more, I'll do another podcast about that. But that might be something that if you have a young child dealing with that, you might want to stay on top of the creatine research and consider trying that. So, okay, if you're interested then in taking creatine, and I think everyone should be interested, here's the good news. Creatine is super cheap as a supplement. You can get like a year's supply of it for probably, I don't know, $50. It's not expensive at all. It's widely available, and you can get it at pretty much any. You can get it at Walmart. You can get it at any vitamin store. You can order it on. What creatine to buy? If you do go to a vitamin store, you'll probably see that there's multiple forms of creatine. The one that is tried and true and that has been tested and is used in all of the hundreds of studies that have been done is basic, simple creatine monohydrate. And it'll say that right on the label. When you look at the ingredients, it'll say creatine monohydrate, other ingredients, none. Okay, so you can just buy a big tub of creatine monohydrate. That's the gold standard. That's what's been used in all the studies. That's what's been shown to be overwhelmingly safe for pretty much everyone. As far as dosage, 5 grams per day of creatine monohydrate is what's usually recommended. Although, as I've mentioned, a lot of people now are experimenting with higher dosages, especially if you want those brain health benefits. The studies on bone health were done with about 10 or 11 grams per day. And then the studies on brain health showed a lot of benefits taking up to 20 grams per day. And again, no side effects, no issues, totally safe to take at any of those dosages for pretty much everyone. As always, I have to say consult with your doctor first. I am not a doctor, but the studies show that it's got an incredible safety profile, even at 20 grams per day. Now, the only time when you might want to consider taking a different form of creatine, aside from, different from creatine monohydrate, is if you have a very sensitive stomach and you get GI or, stomach issues from taking creatine monohydrate. It happens rarely, but in some people, when they take creatine monohydrate, they get bloating or like a gurgling stomach or just an uncomfortable sensation in their stomach. It's really unusual, like really rare. 99% of people can take creatine monohydrate just fine. But if you are one of those people who gets GI upset from creatine monohydrate, then you can look for a form of creatine called creatine hydrochloride. So that's on the label, it'll probably say creatine HCl. And creatine HCl is just a little gentler on the stomach, and people who have sensitive stomachs can usually tolerate that just fine. For most people, I'd say stick to regular creatine monohydrate, mainly because creatine HCl is a lot more expensive. So if you have GI issues or a sensitive stomach, you might have to pay a little more for the creatine HCl, but I think for almost everyone, plain, pure, cheap creatine monohydrate will work just fine. And then when to take it. So one of the cool things about creatine, you can take it pretty much any time. I personally take it morning, often in the afternoon, and often at night before bed. I like to split it up throughout the day. You could take it all at once. You could take it in the morning or in the evening. One good idea, though, is especially if you're taking it for sports performance or increased muscle mass and strength, that kind of thing, a good idea is to take it near your workout. And that's only because when we work out, we have more blood flow to our muscles, and you're more likely to deliver more of that creatine to your muscles. So maybe a little bit of creatine, if you're taking 10 grams a day, let's say, you could take 5 grams before your workout and another 5 grams after your workout, just to make sure that you get as much into your muscles as possible. If you're taking 20 grams per day, I might take 5 grams in the morning when I wake up, another 5 before a workout, another 5 after a workout, and then another 5 before bed, something like that. That'd be a nice way to split it up. But again, it really doesn't matter too much. The important thing is to take it consistently day after day to slowly build up those creatine stores in your body. And I think that's pretty much it. So I hope that was educational. I hope that was helpful. And maybe some of you will decide to start taking creatine because of some of the benefits that you didn't know existed. I really think that there's only a few supplements that I consider to be really important for everyone to take, and that I kind of recommend that I think are beneficial for almost everyone. And for me personally, creatine is high on that list. So hope that gave you something to think about, and I will see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting our sponsors, Native Path Supplements and Lombardi Chiropractic. Your support helps us to bring you 2 new episodes each month. See the show notes for more details and a nice discount from our sponsors. Thank you, and see you next time on the Co-Movement Gym Podcast.